What if your own brother told the world he no longer recognized you? What if the person who grew up beside you, laughed with you, cried with you, suddenly declared that you were no longer the person they knew? Or perhaps never were? That's exactly the explosive revelation shaking the British monarchy today. And it's not just headlines or gossip. It's a story that cuts deep, that rips through the fabric of family, fame, and loyalty. What Prince William recently said about Prince Harry has left the entire UK in shock and left Harry himself in tears. But why did it come to this? And what does it mean for the royal family, for the monarchy, and for the world watching from the outside? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Before we get into the explosive details, we have to go back to the beginning. Because to understand why William would make such a heart-stopping statement, and why Harry would react with heartbreak, you have to understand what once connected these brothers. Most people only see the public image, the polished appearances at royal events, the carefully staged smiles for photographers, the lines and etiquette drilled into them since birth. But behind closed palace doors, William and Harry shared a bond that was, at least at one time, unshakable. Imagine a childhood under the gaze of millions. Your every action observed, analyzed, and broadcast. Every smile scrutinized. Every tear magnified. That was William and Harry. And yet, in spite of the pressure, the grief, the impossible expectations, there was a genuine closeness. They weren't just princes, they were brothers first. Playful, mischievous, sometimes getting into trouble together. Harry, with his impulsive charm and irrepressible energy, often pushing the limits. William, the more serious, methodical elder, keeping Harry in check, but laughing when no one was watching. There were secret games in the gardens of Kensington Palace. Late-night conversations whispered across bedrooms. Shared grief when their mother, Princess Diana, tragically died, and shared comfort as they navigated life without her guidance. Those moments were formative. They were intimate. They were real. And yet, as life carried them forward, cracks began to appear. It didn't happen overnight. These cracks were subtle at first, like hairline fractures in a glass vase that looks perfectly intact. Public appearances hinted at minor tensions, small disagreements on protocol, a hint of frustration during interviews, subtle differences in demeanor. Harry's recklessness sometimes clashed with William's careful planning. William's seriousness occasionally made Harry feel constrained, even misunderstood. The world never noticed. The cameras, the tabloids, they didn't capture the private moments of hurt, of miscommunication, of unspoken resentment. But the real fracture began with tragedy, the loss of Diana. A mother gone far too soon, leaving behind two boys barely old enough to understand the magnitude of their grief. William, only 15 at the time, took on a mantle of responsibility, trying to shield his younger brother from the full weight of the media storm. Harry, only 12, was thrown into a whirlwind of attention, sympathy, and confusion. Some say that was when the paths of the brothers began to diverge, not in love or loyalty, but in coping mechanisms. William channeled his grief into duty. Harry searched for connection in bold, sometimes reckless actions. And as they grew older, those coping mechanisms hardened into differing life philosophies: duty versus personal freedom, public image versus personal truth. Then came adulthood, and with it, the full weight of royal expectation. The world expected perfection. The monarchy demanded loyalty. Every choice, every relationship, every word spoken publicly carried consequences not just for the individual, but for an institution centuries old. William embraced it. He understood, perhaps more than anyone, that personal feelings had to sometimes yield to responsibility. Harry, meanwhile, began to chafe against the invisible chains of protocol. The two brothers, once partners in mischief and laughter, began to drift. Enter Meghan Markle. Her arrival into Harry's life brought a whirlwind of attention, a new perspective, and, for some, a sense of liberation. Harry seemed happier, yes, but also emboldened. The couple's relationship became both a media sensation and a lightning rod for controversy. William watched, concerned, not only for Harry, but for the monarchy itself. He saw choices being made, choices that put personal desire over family unity, fame over loyalty, public exposure over private discretion. And he spoke about it, privately first. Words of concern, words of advice, words of warning. But Harry, in his pursuit of autonomy and, ultimately, fame, often ignored these messages. The tension escalated publicly. Oprah, Netflix deals, interviews, books, social media commentary that painted Harry in one light, William in another, and the monarchy somewhere in the middle, caught in a storm of personal betrayal and public spectacle. It's no wonder that William eventually reached a breaking point. Because for him, this wasn't just about Harry. It was about trust, loyalty, and the sacred bond of brotherhood being strained to its absolute limit. And when William finally spoke, the words were devastating. "I don't recognize my brother anymore," he reportedly said. He chose fame over family. Imagine hearing that from someone who knew every secret you've ever kept, every triumph and every failure, every tear shed in private. Imagine the impact on Harry, who, for all his charisma and media savvy, is still, at his core, a human being with the same need for familial connection as anyone else. Reports indicate that Harry broke down in private, overwhelmed with emotion, confronting a truth he could neither escape nor deny. Now, you might be asking yourself, what exactly did William mean? Was it just a fleeting comment made in anger, or a deeply considered statement reflecting years of disappointment and heartbreak? What events, what choices, what public moments pushed this relationship to the edge? And more importantly, what will happen next? Will reconciliation ever be possible, or is this a permanent fracture that will define their lives and the monarchy for generations? Throughout this video, we're going to dive deep into the story. We'll explore the history of William and Harry's relationship from childhood, through their teenage years, and into the adult crises that brought them to this moment of shocking revelation. We'll examine the influence of media scrutiny, public expectation, and personal choices. We'll uncover private confrontations that were never meant to be public, the emotional toll on both brothers, and the impact on the British public. We'll share surprising facts, overlooked details, and expert perspectives that reveal why this story is far more than just tabloid fodder. It's a saga of loyalty, betrayal, grief, and the human cost of fame. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand not just what was said, but why it mattered, and why it left Harry crying in ways the world never expected. But before we get there, you need to know how it all started. How two boys who once played together in the gardens of Kensington Palace grew into men whose bond would be tested in ways most of us can only imagine. Because what comes next isn't just a story about royalty. It's a story about family, choices, and the painful, heartbreaking consequences when love and loyalty collide with fame and ambition. And here's the kicker. Some of the most shocking moments, the ones that truly left the UK in disbelief, didn't even make the headlines at first. They happened behind closed doors, in private conversations and personal reflections, moments captured only by those closest to the brothers. And yet, when those moments finally surfaced, they didn't just make news. They changed the conversation about family, duty, and fame forever. So, what happened during those private moments? What did William say that pushed Harry to tears? And what can the rest of us learn from this story about trust, loyalty, and the dangerous allure of fame? We'll get into all of that. But first, we have to start at the beginning. Because to understand the explosive present, you must understand the past. And trust me, the past is far more complicated than anyone has imagined. Filled with moments of joy, betrayal, heartbreak, and irony. Moments that make you question what it really means to be a brother, a family member, and a public figure all at once. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever wondered what it's like to grow up in a world where your every action is scrutinized, where your laughter can become a headline, and your tears are dissected for public consumption? Imagine that world, but with a twin set of eyes watching you. Your brother's eyes, filled with trust, rivalry, and unspoken understanding. That was the world of William and Harry as children, long before fame, long before controversy, long before the cracks in their relationship began to show in public. From the very beginning, William and Harry were inseparable in ways most siblings are not. Kensington Palace Gardens became their playground, corridors their racetrack, and rooms their secret kingdoms. The staff often spoke of two boys racing from room to room, giggling, whispering secrets, and daring each other into playful mischief. Harry, with his mischievous grin and boundless energy, would often provoke William into games he didn't want to play but secretly loved. William, the elder by 2 years, would sometimes feign irritation, but behind that frown was pride and a protective instinct that would shape his character forever. The palace, as grand and imposing as it was, couldn't contain their bond. Their mother, Princess Diana, recognized it immediately. She often recounted in interviews and in private conversations with aides that her sons were each other's anchors. William, more grounded and reflective, would keep Harry from straying too far. Harry, more impulsive and emotionally expressive, would draw William into moments of spontaneity that reminded him he was still a child at heart. Together, they created a world that was theirs alone, even under the constant gaze of the media and royal staff. But even in this idyllic-sounding childhood, tensions were quietly simmering. You might think, how could there be tension between two young boys who loved each other so deeply? Yet, the seeds of rivalry, comparison, and the pressure of expectations were already being planted. William, always first in line for future responsibilities, carried the weight of duty on his small shoulders. Harry, aware of this and yet yearning for his own identity, sometimes rebelled, pushing boundaries, testing limits, seeking attention in ways William didn't need. Can you imagine being the younger brother, always in someone else's shadow, yet adored for your charm and wild energy? The emotional complexity was there from the start. Even at the age of 10, the brothers were experiencing loss, though not yet fully comprehending the magnitude. They witnessed their mother's attention divided between charity work, royal duties, and the constant media scrutiny. They saw how the world celebrated and criticized Diana simultaneously. For William, these were lessons in restraint, observation, and responsibility. For Harry, these were lessons in empathy, rebellion, and the need to forge an identity outside the public eye. The differences in how they internalized these lessons would later manifest in ways that shocked the world. Do you remember the stories of the Diana effect? Princess Diana's deep connection with her sons went beyond typical parenting. She shielded them from the harshest elements of public life, even as they were growing up under the constant gaze of the media. Diana's guidance helped form the emotional cores of both William and Harry, but it also created contrasts. William often took lessons of duty, composure, and tradition deeply to heart. Harry took lessons of humanity, compassion, and emotional openness to extremes, sometimes putting him at odds with the very world they were born into. And yet, despite these differences, the brothers had moments of pure joy, unfiltered by expectation. Their escapades at Sandringham and Balmoral, the jokes whispered in corridors, the small rebellions against palace rules, these weren't mere childhood antics. They were bonding rituals, forming a foundation that, for a time, seemed unbreakable. Staff members recalled Harry climbing onto rooftops to retrieve stray tennis balls, while William shouted for him to be careful, yet secretly admired his daring spirit. But even in those early moments, contradictions were emerging. William's natural caution clashed with Harry's impulsiveness. Harry's desire for adventure sometimes left William frustrated. Can you imagine watching someone you love make reckless choices, knowing the consequences could be devastating, yet also knowing that's part of who they are? This tension, though minor as children, foreshadowed the dramatic rifts that would erupt later in life. And then there were the games that tested their courage and loyalty, moments that now, in retrospect, reveal so much about their character. There was one story, told by a former palace aide, of a dare that involved climbing a tree in the palace gardens, high enough to see over the fences, where they could observe the world beyond their carefully controlled environment. William hesitated, measuring risk and consequence. Harry leapt without thought, shouting for William to follow. William did. They laughed, heart pounding, completely alive. But these small acts of defiance, of pushing limits, were also early lessons in trust, risk, and dependency, lessons they would need later in life, in ways neither could have imagined as children. What's fascinating is how their bond, though intensely close, always had an undercurrent of tension that mirrored adult dynamics. William, even as a boy, seemed aware of the expectations placed upon him. Harry, always more emotional, felt the burden of those expectations differently, sometimes resisting, sometimes embracing in his own way. The differences were subtle at first. The way William would reprimand, the way Harry would retort, the moments of silent frustration, but they were there. And as the years passed, these small differences would grow into glaring contrasts, amplified by the pressures of adolescence, public scrutiny, and eventually, royal duty. You have to ask yourself, how does a relationship survive when one brother is always measured and cautious, and the other is wild, impulsive, and deeply emotional? How do these dynamics evolve when grief enters the picture and tragedy strikes at the heart of what should have been a protected, loving environment? It's not hard to see, looking back, why even in childhood, cracks were forming. They were invisible at the time, hidden beneath laughter and shared secrets, but they were there, a subtle foreshadowing of the rifts that would leave the UK stunned decades later. And then came the moments that truly tested their bond. Simple arguments over games, disagreements on palace rules, small acts of defiance. They may seem trivial, but in the context of a royal upbringing, every action had weight. Every misstep could be recorded, criticized, and remembered. Every private act of rebellion was also an emotional statement. These moments built layers of understanding, frustration, and emotional complexity that would later explode when fame, media scrutiny, and adult choices collided. By the time they reached adolescence, William and Harry were no longer just mischievous boys playing in palace corridors. They were young men beginning to understand the implications of their family legacy, the deaths of those around them, the expectations placed on them, and the awareness of the world's constant gaze started shaping who they were becoming. Yet despite the weight, their bond endured. Moments of laughter, support, and loyalty persisted, keeping them connected even as their individual identities started to diverge. And it wasn't all serious. There were the practical jokes, the playful competitions, and the whispered strategies to avoid staff reprimands. These memories, though seemingly lighthearted, were crucial. They created shared histories that would later serve as both comfort and source of pain. When William later made his shocking declaration about Harry, he was speaking not just about present behavior, but about a lifetime of shared experiences, expectations, and heartbreak. He was speaking from a place of intimate knowledge of Harry's character, built over decades of closeness, and the deep disappointment that comes from feeling that the bond is slipping away. By now, you might be wondering, if their bond was so strong, so deeply rooted, why did it fracture so completely later? Was it inevitable? Could it have been prevented? Or were there events and choices that pushed them past the point of reconciliation? The answers lie in the years that followed, in the teenage tensions, in the media scrutiny, in the choices both made as young adults. The foundation of love and loyalty was there, but the pressures were immense, and the world was watching. And yet, even in the shadow of these early cracks, there was hope, innocence, and joy, elements that make the later betrayals, the tears, and the shocking public statements all the more painful. You see, understanding the bond before fame, before scandal, is crucial to understanding why William's words hit Harry so hard. Because it's not just a public feud. It's a personal betrayal, felt in the deepest layers of brotherhood. But as childhood gave way to adolescence, and adolescence gave way to young adulthood, the brothers began to walk different paths. The very traits that made them inseparable as boys, William's caution, Harry's impulsiveness, started to pull them apart. Their choices, influenced by grief, pressure, and ambition, would set the stage for one of the most shocking and emotional family stories in modern royal history. And it all started here, in the hidden moments of Kensington Palace, in the gardens where they played, in the whispered laughter of two brothers unaware of the storms yet to come. But what happened during those teenage years would create a rift that even the strongest bonds could not easily bridge, a rift that would later leave Harry in tears and the UK in disbelief. But what happened during those teenage years would create a rift that even the strongest bonds could not easily bridge, a rift that would later leave Harry in tears and the UK in disbelief. Have you ever looked at siblings and wondered why some of the closest relationships in childhood suddenly shift into rivalry? What if the very person who once made you laugh every day started to feel like a stranger, even a competitor? For William and Harry, that shift began quietly during their teenage years. The garden games and whispered secrets of childhood gave way to something more complicated. Expectations, responsibility, and the stark realities of royalty pressing in from all sides. As teenagers, the brothers were not just navigating typical adolescent challenges. They were growing up under the unrelenting gaze of the world. Every school report, every public appearance, every misstep was noted, photographed, and often sensationalized. William, always the elder, felt the weight of duty keenly. He understood that the monarchy demanded discipline, composure, and foresight. Harry, younger, more impulsive, felt constrained by the invisible rules that bound them. He wanted freedom, adventure, and his own space to make mistakes, sometimes loudly, sometimes rebelliously. Can you imagine the frustration of wanting to carve your own identity when the world constantly compares you to your older brother? The tension was inevitable. Rivalries emerged in subtle ways at first. Academic achievements, sports, and public recognition became arenas for comparison. William often excelled in traditional areas, impressing teachers, staff, and the public with his poise and diligence. Harry, while capable, was more focused on the interpersonal, emotional, and often mischievous aspects of life. Where William thrived in structure, Harry thrived in spontaneity. That difference, innocent in childhood, now became a source of friction. But rivalry wasn't just about academics or appearances, it was about identity. William, born into the line of succession, understood that his choices would define him publicly. Harry, aware that he was second in line, sometimes acted as if the rules didn't apply to him and often tested boundaries. Did he rebel intentionally? Sometimes yes. Sometimes it was simply a reflection of his energetic, impulsive personality. The result, however, was constant tension. Can you imagine growing up with your every action weighed against your siblings' accomplishments? It's enough to create resentment, even in the closest of families. Yet, these tensions were interspersed with moments of loyalty and love. There were times when Harry would stand up for William in moments of public scrutiny. There were times when William would protect Harry from media backlash or offer guidance without reprimand. But as with any relationship, the push and pull of rivalry versus loyalty grew more intense as the boys approached adulthood. Every victory, every failure, every slight, real or imagined, contributed to an invisible ledger of grievances and misunderstandings. Some insiders have shared stories of minor arguments in which Harry's impulsiveness clashed with William's composure. Simple disagreements over schedules, homework, or royal etiquette could escalate into emotional conflicts. Imagine being constantly monitored, having no true private space, and trying to assert your individuality while simultaneously carrying the expectations of centuries. William would often be measured, deliberate, strategic. Harry would act first, then feel the consequences later. The pattern repeated, setting the stage for long-term tension. These teenage years also introduced their first public exposures. Paparazzi were no longer a distant threat. They became a constant presence. The boys' actions, once private, were now fodder for tabloids. Stories of fights, pranks, or misbehavior circulated widely. William, conscious of his public image, often handled these incidents with restraint. Harry, however, sometimes found the exposure exhilarating, an opportunity to assert his personality and defy expectations. The media, unknowingly, began to shape the rift, framing Harry as the reckless younger brother and William as the dutiful, responsible heir. Can you see how this might plant seeds of resentment, frustration, and emotional distance? Irony played a role as well. In many ways, William admired Harry's bravery and authenticity. He knew his younger brother had a heart full of loyalty and compassion, and a courage that was unmatched. But at the same time, William couldn't ignore what he saw as recklessness. Every risk Harry took, whether personal, social, or public, threatened not just himself, but the image of the monarchy, which William felt personally responsible for preserving. The contradictions were clear. Admiration mingled with frustration, love intertwined with exasperation. And then there were moments that went beyond the normal sibling rivalry. Some stories reveal early hints of rebellion that foreshadowed Harry's later choices. There were incidents of sneaking out, minor rule-breaking, or public misbehavior that, while seemingly trivial at the time, later became symbolic of Harry's desire for independence. William's response was often to counsel, to correct, to try to align Harry with expectations. But each intervention sometimes pushed Harry further into defiance. The tension escalated quietly, like a storm brewing on the horizon, unseen by the public, but palpable within the palace walls. At the same time, the tragedy of Diana's death added another layer. Teenage William and Harry were now coping with grief, media pressure, and the onset of adult responsibilities. Their emotional responses diverged sharply. William internalized grief, channeling it into duty and control. Harry externalized grief, expressing it through action, boldness, and sometimes rebellion. The contrast, while natural in siblings, began to deepen into misunderstanding. William might see Harry as reckless or irresponsible. Harry might see William as rigid or emotionally distant. And in these misunderstandings, the emotional rift grew. This period also featured early romantic and social experiences that introduced new dynamics. While details are largely private, insiders suggest that Harry's first experiences with friendships, dating, and social circles were often contrasted against William's more measured approach. The differences in personality, judgment, and public perception created friction and subtle jealousy. Harry felt constrained by rules. William felt frustrated by risk-taking. The emotional beats here are subtle but crucial. They illustrate how their paths began to diverge long before fame amplified the divide. Perhaps most significant was the sense of loyalty and betrayal that started to emerge in these teenage years. It was the first time William may have felt Harry acting in ways that prioritized personal desire over shared responsibility. And while Harry never intended to betray, the perception of divergence in values planted seeds of doubt, hurt, and eventual disappointment. Can you imagine that feeling? Watching the person you once trusted implicitly begin to make choices that, while understandable, seem to break the unspoken code of brotherhood? That emotional weight is something neither public opinion nor media analysis can fully capture. By the end of these teenage years, the brothers had already begun to develop distinct identities. William, the dutiful heir, disciplined and strategic. Harry, the adventurous younger brother, charismatic, emotional, and increasingly independent. The foundation of their childhood bond was still there, yes, but tension and rivalry had layered over it like cracks forming beneath a seemingly perfect surface. And as they prepared to enter adulthood, these differences would be amplified by new pressures: media scrutiny, romantic relationships, royal obligations, and, eventually, global attention. So, here's the question. Could this rivalry have been prevented? Could William and Harry have navigated adolescence without friction, without misunderstandings, without resentment? Perhaps. But the reality of growing up under the public eye, in a family bound by duty and tradition, made friction inevitable. And what began as subtle rivalry would later manifest in ways that shocked the entire UK, in ways that would leave Harry in tears and the monarchy scrambling to manage the fallout. And the irony is striking. For all their differences, William and Harry were still brothers, still linked by blood, by shared grief, and by decades of memories. Yet, by the time Harry reached young adulthood, the tension had evolved into something far more complicated. Not just rivalry, but emotional distance, a divergence of priorities, and a growing sense that perhaps they were no longer truly on the same path. The foundation was there, yes, but the cracks had deepened. And as we'll see in the next chapters, those cracks would widen dramatically with the arrival of Meghan Markle, public scrutiny, and choices that would shake the very core of their relationship. Because what comes next is not just a story about teenage rivalry. It's a story about trust broken, expectations unmet, and the painful realization that sometimes love and loyalty are not enough to prevent heartbreak. And as the world would soon see, the consequences of these teenage tensions would echo far beyond the palace walls, leaving one brother in tears and the other delivering words that would shock an entire nation. And as the world would soon see, the consequences of these teenage tensions would echo far beyond the palace walls, leaving one brother in tears and the other delivering words that would shock an entire nation. Have you ever lost someone so pivotal that life suddenly felt like it had fractured in two? Imagine losing your mother at an age when the world was already heavy with expectation. Imagine feeling grief under the glare of thousands of cameras, journalists, and well-meaning strangers analyzing your every move. For William and Harry, that unimaginable tragedy came on a summer night in 1997. The death of Princess Diana was more than just a family loss. It was a seismic event that would define both of their lives forever, shaping their emotional cores, their relationship, and their understanding of the world. William was 15 at the time, Harry just 12. To the outside world, they were young princes, poised and composed in the public eye. But behind palace walls, their grief was raw, unfiltered, and complicated. Diana's death didn't just take their mother away. It also stripped them of the protector, the guide, and the emotional anchor they had relied upon. The public demanded composure, tradition demanded restraint. And in that silence, the boys had to navigate a world far beyond their years. William responded to grief the way he would later approach every challenge in life, with responsibility, focus, and an acute awareness of duty. He understood, at least intuitively, that he had to step up, not just for Harry, but for the monarchy, the public, and the legacy his mother left behind. He carried the weight of expectation with dignity, hiding the full brunt of his emotional pain behind a mask of composure. Yet inside, there was confusion, anger, and sorrow. He felt a deep responsibility to protect his younger brother, to guide him through the storm, but also the burden of his own grief pressing down on him. Harry's response was different, immediate, and visceral. He was younger, more emotionally raw, and less inclined to shield his feelings from the world. He expressed his grief openly, sometimes impulsively, sometimes rebelliously. There are accounts of him lashing out, seeking solace in action rather than words, and clinging to moments of comfort wherever he could find them. In many ways, Harry's response was a precursor to the impulsive decisions that would later define his adult life, choices that William, grounded in caution and duty, would struggle to understand. The contrast between the brothers was stark, and it planted the earliest seeds of tension that would ripple throughout their lives. William, disciplined and strategic, expected measured responses to grief. Harry, impulsive and emotional, wanted freedom to express himself, to act, to escape the pressure of public scrutiny. Their different coping mechanisms were not inherently wrong, but they were incompatible in the context of a family that was already under extreme pressure. And the world watched. Paparazzi captured the smallest details, the tears, the gestures, the body language, and the public dissected every moment. The boys' grief was transformed into spectacle, analyzed and commented on endlessly. Imagine being a child, mourning the loss of your mother, and discovering that every expression of sorrow or frustration is being broadcast to millions. It's the kind of pressure that would strain any relationship, even one as close as theirs. Yet, despite these differences, the tragedy also reinforced their bond. In private moments, away from cameras and the media, William and Harry clung to each other. They shared memories of their mother, talked about their fears, and tried to navigate a world that suddenly felt unmoored. There were late-night conversations, whispered promises, and moments of comfort that reinforced their brotherhood. But these moments were fleeting, and the pressures outside their room continued to mount, shaping their personalities in ways they would carry into adulthood. The trauma of Diana's death also introduced a deeper understanding of public responsibility. Both brothers realized that their actions would be scrutinized not just as individuals, but as symbols. William internalized this lesson quickly, understanding the delicate balance between personal grief and public expectation. Harry, more instinctual and emotionally driven, sometimes resisted it, seeking authenticity in ways that clashed with the monarchy's rigid structures. The tension between authenticity and duty, between personal feeling and public expectation, would become a recurring theme in their relationship. Even within the palace, there were lessons learned about resilience, loyalty, and emotional control. Mentors, aides, and family members guided the boys, but no guidance could fully shield them from the weight of grief. The emotional scars from this period were subtle yet profound, shaping how each brother would approach challenges, relationships, and, eventually, fame. William's careful, measured approach to life can be traced directly to these formative years of loss and responsibility. Harry's impulsive, emotionally driven choices can also be traced back here, to the need for connection, freedom, and understanding that the world was rarely willing to provide. And the effects were not limited to private moments. Publicly, the tragedy forced them into roles neither of them was prepared to occupy. Funeral processions, public appearances, and statements to the press demanded composure, diplomacy, and restraint. For William, this was a call to leadership. For Harry, it was a constant test of patience, impulse, and identity. The pressure to conform, to perform grief in the right way, created tensions that even sibling closeness could not fully mitigate. Yet even in grief, there were sparks of their enduring bond. Shared memories of Diana, stories whispered late at night, and small acts of care for one another kept their connection alive. William would sometimes quietly reassure Harry during moments of fear or confusion. Harry would protect William in subtle ways, offering emotional support and humor when tension became unbearable. These moments remind us that even in the face of tragedy, love and loyalty can persist, though they can also be complicated, messy, and incomplete. And here's where the tension deepened further. The loss of Diana not only changed their emotional landscape, but also set in motion the diverging paths that would define their adult lives. William embraced the lessons of duty, composure, and long-term vision. Harry, seeking to reconcile grief, freedom, and identity, sometimes made choices that seemed impulsive, sometimes even reckless, from William's perspective. Can you see how this might plant seeds of misunderstanding, frustration, and, eventually, the kind of heartbreak William would later articulate publicly? The trauma also had an unexpected consequence. It highlighted the differences in how the brothers perceived loyalty and responsibility. William began to see leadership, duty, and family as inseparable, a sacred triad that required sacrifice. Harry, while deeply loyal, sometimes viewed these concepts through the lens of personal authenticity and emotional truth. This subtle divergence would later become one of the most significant sources of conflict in their adult relationship. You might wonder, how does a tragedy like this shape a person's decisions decades later? The answer is complicated. Grief leaves an imprint that affects everything: emotional responses, trust, priorities, and relationships. For William, it created a sense of unwavering duty and a clear moral compass. For Harry, it created a need for emotional expression, freedom, and sometimes rebellion against perceived constraints. These contrasting responses were not wrong or right. They were human. But when two brothers, raised in the same environment, respond differently to trauma, misunderstandings are inevitable. And let's not forget the world watching. Every choice, every expression, every step the brothers took after Diana's death was dissected, analyzed, and judged. The media framed William as the composed, dutiful elder, Harry as the emotional, impulsive younger brother. These portrayals, often oversimplified, reinforced the differences between them and influenced public perception. The pressure to live up to these labels added another layer of strain to an already delicate relationship. The Diana effect was also a lesson in contrast. William's disciplined, reflective nature began to crystallize, preparing him for future leadership and responsibility. Harry's emotional, spontaneous tendencies became more pronounced, shaping his later pursuit of independence, celebrity, and self-expression. The foundation of childhood love remained, yes, but it now existed alongside the weight of trauma, expectation, and diverging identities. So, what can we take from this period? First, that the grief of losing a parent, especially under the world's scrutiny, is transformative. Second, that sibling relationships, even the closest ones, are vulnerable to differences in coping mechanisms. And third, that the seeds of adult conflict are often planted in childhood and adolescence, watered by loss, pressure, and misunderstanding. For William and Harry, the Diana effect was not just personal. It was generational, institutional, and profoundly influential in shaping the story that would later shock the UK. And here's the most heartbreaking part. Despite everything, they still loved each other. The loyalty, the bond, and the shared history persisted. Even as tensions grew, misunderstandings deepened, and the pressures of adolescence and early adulthood shaped them in opposing directions. It's that love, complicated and sometimes obscured by pain, that makes William's later statement, I don't recognize my brother anymore. Both devastating and relatable. But as we'll see, the next stage of their lives, the intense media scrutiny, the rise of public expectation, and the eventual entry of Meghan Markle, would test their bond in ways neither brother could have anticipated. And what came next would transform sibling rivalry into a conflict that reverberated across the monarchy and left an entire nation stunned. And what came next would transform sibling rivalry into a conflict that reverberated across the monarchy and left an entire nation stunned. Have you ever felt like the walls were closing in on you? Like every word you spoke, every choice you made, was being judged, dissected, and broadcast to a world you didn't fully understand? Imagine that, but magnified 1,000 times, and applied to two young men growing up in the most scrutinized family on the planet. That was the reality for William and Harry as they moved through adolescence into young adulthood. And the pressure wasn't just from within their family. It came from every corner of the media, every gossip columnist, every paparazzo lying in wait, ready to turn a minor misstep into a global headline. By the time they were teenagers, the British press had already claimed a role in shaping public perception. Every smile, every frown, every small rebellion was documented. William, with his calm and measured demeanor, often handled scrutiny with grace. But Harry, more impulsive and emotionally expressive, sometimes clashed with the omnipresent gaze. These dynamics weren't just about image. They were about identity, about control, and about survival in a world that demanded perfection. It started with subtle intrusions. Photographers capturing candid moments in the gardens, tabloids analyzing playground antics, reporters speculating on school performance, friendships, and even minor disagreements. While most teenagers worry about tests and social status, William and Harry had an entire nation's eyes on them. The difference in how they handled it became apparent quickly. William, already leaning toward discipline and foresight, learned early to shield himself, to internalize emotion, and to control his reactions. Harry, on the other hand, felt trapped, frustrated, and constantly misunderstood. Imagine being in Harry's shoes. You're grieving your mother. You're navigating adolescence under immense scrutiny. You want to express yourself authentically, to act impulsively, to make choices that feel real. But the cameras, the media, and even the adults around you insist on composure. Every spontaneous action is analyzed. Every emotional outburst is branded as a character flaw. It's exhausting, isolating, and often infuriating. No wonder Harry developed a tendency to rebel, to push boundaries, to seek freedom in ways that would later make headlines around the world. Meanwhile, William felt a different kind of pressure. As the elder, as the future king, he understood that his actions were not his own. They carried symbolic weight. Every perceived lapse in judgment wasn't just personal. It reflected on the monarchy, on the institution, and on the legacy his mother had left behind. That sense of responsibility created a natural tension with Harry, who often prioritized personal truth over expectation. Can you see the emotional contradiction here? William was constrained by duty, Harry by the desire for freedom. Both were under pressure, yet the pressure manifested in dramatically different ways. It's also important to remember that the media didn't just report, they shaped narratives. Tabloids loved the story of the dutiful elder brother versus the impulsive younger brother. Every misstep by Harry was framed as recklessness, while every controlled act by William reinforced his image as the responsible heir. And the more the media amplified these narratives, the more the brothers internalized them, sometimes consciously, often unconsciously. The lens of public perception began to influence private relationships, subtly altering expectations, interpretations, and even emotional responses. The impact of these pressures became especially visible in adolescence and young adulthood. Consider the public engagements, charity events, and early royal duties. William approached them with careful preparation, strategic thinking, and an acute awareness of optics. Harry, while capable and committed, often acted with spontaneity, sometimes drawing attention for behavior that was less conventional or more emotionally raw. To William, these actions could seem reckless, irresponsible, or even harmful to their shared reputation. To Harry, they were authentic expressions of self, sometimes necessary for emotional survival. And the stakes were enormous. Every headline, every photograph, every snippet of leaked information contributed to a sense of public judgment and expectation. Mistakes were magnified, successes were analyzed, and the brothers' differences became public fodder. Imagine knowing that every private disagreement, every personal choice, could be twisted into a narrative of failure or conflict. The psychological toll is staggering. No wonder that tensions, once minor, escalated into emotional rifts. There's also the ironic twist that some of the most private lessons were learned in the most public of ways. William, observing the media frenzy, honed restraint, self-control, and strategic thinking. Harry, observing the same frenzy, learned both resilience and the limits of public tolerance. These lessons shaped them individually, but also amplified their differences, creating a divide that would later fuel public and private conflicts. And it wasn't just the British press. International media, paparazzi networks, and tabloids across Europe and the United States monitored every move. Harry's impulsive decisions, whether public appearances or private missteps, were broadcast worldwide. William, ever conscious of legacy, often had to mitigate these impacts, balancing family loyalty with the demands of monarchy. Can you imagine that balancing act? Every reaction, every choice, every word had consequences that stretched far beyond personal relationships. They could influence public trust in an entire institution. One of the most striking aspects of this period was the subtle emotional toll it took on both brothers. William's calm exterior often hid deep frustration and concern. He watched Harry make choices he felt were dangerous, reckless, or inconsistent with family expectations. Harry's visible impulsiveness, on the other hand, often masked anxiety, frustration, and a yearning for autonomy. It's a complex dynamic: love, loyalty, frustration, and misunderstanding, all existing simultaneously. And then came the public milestones, school achievements, royal tours, charity launches, and early leadership roles. Each moment was a test, not just of skill or composure, but of emotional resilience and familial alignment. William approached these milestones with a sense of duty, often mentoring Harry along the way, sometimes gently, sometimes sternly. Harry, while grateful for guidance, increasingly prioritized his own interpretation of success, sometimes clashing with William's advice. These clashes, though minor at first, became recurring patterns that would later define their adult conflicts. Media pressure also created irony. The world often saw William as controlled, precise, and emotionally disciplined, and admired him for it. Harry, more expressive and impulsive, was simultaneously criticized and romanticized. Some hailed him as courageous and authentic. Others condemned him for recklessness. This duality created tension not just in public perception, but in private, as William sometimes struggled to reconcile admiration for his brother's authenticity with frustration at its consequences. At the same time, palace protocols and royal expectations amplified these tensions. Rules about public appearances, private conduct, and familial loyalty were rigid, sometimes suffocating. William, understanding these rules, followed them closely. Harry, yearning for autonomy, sometimes tested or ignored them. The result? Conflicts that were both personal and structural. Their love for each other existed within a framework that didn't always allow flexibility, understanding, or emotional nuance. The culmination of these pressures became more visible in the late teenage years. Private arguments, misunderstandings, and clashes over public behavior increasingly defined their interactions. Small disagreements that might be trivial in a typical family took on enormous weight in the palace. Every choice carried emotional, social, and institutional consequences. And the emotional impact? Harry often felt constrained and misunderstood. William often felt frustrated and burdened with responsibility. Their bond, though still present, was being tested in ways no child or teenager could fully comprehend. And it wasn't just about the immediate pressures. The long-term implications were profound. William's early lessons in discipline, public perception, and leadership became the foundation of his adult approach. Harry's early lessons in emotional expression, independence, and resilience became the foundation of his adult choices. These lessons, learned under pressure, were crucial in shaping the events that would later shock the UK: the public feud, the tears, and William's words that left Harry reeling. But here's the question: Could any of this have been avoided? Could the brothers have navigated adolescence under such intense scrutiny without conflict? Perhaps, but the convergence of grief, public expectation, and individual temperament made tension inevitable. And the choices they made during this time would echo through their adult lives, influencing relationships, decisions, and the eventual rift that would leave one brother in tears and the other delivering a statement heard around the world. As we move into the next chapter, it's important to remember the emotional foundation laid here. Grief that shaped identity, scrutiny that amplified differences, and pressure that transformed rivalry into a lasting emotional fracture. These forces would only intensify in the years ahead, as romantic relationships, public life, and personal ambition collided in ways that neither brother could have anticipated. And what comes next? The influence of Meghan Markle, the public interviews, and the choices that would shock an entire nation, will push their bond to a breaking point no one saw coming. And what comes next? The influence of Meghan Markle, the public interviews, and the choices that would shock an entire nation, would push their bond to a breaking point no one saw coming. Have you ever watched someone you love begin a relationship and felt the ground shift beneath you? That's what happened to William and Harry when Meghan Markle entered the picture. For Harry, it was like a gust of wind blowing into his carefully contained life, stirring emotions, ambition, and a desire for autonomy he had long felt constrained from expressing. For William, it was a challenge, a warning signal, and a test of the loyalty and bond he thought was unshakable. But no one could predict just how dramatically this new presence would alter the dynamics of the royal family, the brothers' relationship, and the public's perception of them. From the very beginning, Meghan's entry into Harry's life was anything but quiet. Her charisma, intelligence, and confidence immediately captured attention. But it wasn't just public attention that shifted. The private sphere of the royal family began to feel disruption. William noticed changes in his brother almost immediately. The Harry he knew, playful yet loyal, suddenly seemed different, more assertive, more outspoken, more willing to defy expectations. And while William supported his brother's happiness, the subtle signs of tension quickly became apparent. Let's take a moment to consider the unique pressures of royal life. The palace, steeped in tradition and rigid expectations, was suddenly confronted with a dynamic new presence, a woman from outside the royal institution, with her own career, opinions, and public persona. The cultural and social gap was significant. For Harry, Meghan represented freedom, authenticity, and the possibility of living life on his own terms. For William, she represented a variable that needed careful assessment, a force that could either support or disrupt family harmony. Already, two differing perspectives were emerging on the same situation, one cautious, one emotionally driven. And the media frenzy began almost immediately. Every appearance, every public outing, every subtle gesture was captured, scrutinized, and analyzed. Headlines appeared almost daily, framing Meghan and Harry in ways that amplified tension. Prince Harry's new love rocks the palace. William concerned about brothers' choices. Royal tradition meets modernity. Clash looms. The media, intentionally or not, magnified differences that may have existed in private, presenting the brothers as opposing forces rather than siblings navigating a shared family landscape. Harry, long accustomed to media scrutiny, seemed energized. Meghan's presence gave him a renewed sense of purpose, agency, and, paradoxically, both freedom and responsibility. He embraced their shared public image, pursued high-profile projects, and seemed increasingly willing to challenge the expectations that had shaped his life. William, who had long internalized duty, discretion, and the importance of measured action, grew concerned. He noticed shifts in Harry's priorities, in his tone, in his decisions, subtle at first, but increasingly significant over time. The situation intensified with each public event, from charity appearances to social gatherings. William observed Harry's growing willingness to assert independence in ways that could be perceived as rebellious. Sometimes this manifested in choices that challenged royal protocol. Sometimes it appeared in public statements or interviews. And each time, William was faced with a choice: intervene, advise, or let Harry navigate his own path. His decisions were complicated by a deep sense of loyalty, love, and concern, but also by the awareness that missteps could have consequences far beyond the private family sphere. And then came the moments that truly escalated tensions. Public speculation, media narratives, and private disagreements all converged, creating a pressure cooker environment. William reportedly voiced concerns privately, urging caution, encouraging dialogue, and reminding Harry of familial and institutional responsibilities. Harry, increasingly confident and emotionally assertive, sometimes resisted, sometimes deferred, and sometimes chose to follow his own instincts. These moments of divergence, while subtle to outsiders, were seismic within the family. Can you imagine the frustration, the heartache, and the tension building in private rooms, far from the public gaze? The relationship between Meghan and Harry also brought into sharp focus issues of loyalty and identity. Harry, who had long struggled to balance public expectation with personal desire, found in Meghan a partner who validated his emotional experiences and supported his ambitions. For William, this new dynamic was unfamiliar and potentially destabilizing. The brother he knew, the one he had guided and protected, was making choices that prioritized personal happiness over institutional harmony. And in a family where perception is everything, these private choices became intensely consequential. Then there were the interpersonal nuances that fueled drama. William, protective not only of Harry but of the monarchy, noticed changes in behavior, tone, and even language. Harry became more willing to challenge authority, to push boundaries, to act with autonomy that was previously constrained by expectation. And as Harry's confidence grew, so too did the sense of divergence between the brothers. William felt a growing distance, an emotional gap that words could barely describe. Meanwhile, Harry felt empowered, validated, and increasingly unburdened, yet unaware of how deeply his choices were affecting his brother. The media, of course, seized on these tensions. Reports suggested disagreements over everything from public engagements to personal behavior. Headlines framed Harry as the impulsive younger brother, Meghan as the instigator or catalyst, and William as the concerned elder sibling, a narrative that amplified internal tensions and fueled public fascination. Every subtle action was interpreted as evidence of conflict, even when private conversations revealed nuance, compromise, and concern. This disparity between perception and reality created additional stress, emotional spikes, and miscommunication that would later explode in shocking revelations. And here's where the emotional stakes became profound. Harry, for all his charisma and resilience, was navigating love, grief, public expectation, and personal identity simultaneously. Meghan, though confident and capable, was stepping into a complex, high-pressure world where every action could influence not only Harry's life, but also the reputation of the monarchy. William, ever the guardian of legacy and protocol, watched helplessly at times, concerned for both his brother and the institution. The friction between personal desire and public responsibility was now no longer theoretical. It was real, immediate, and emotionally charged. The tipping point, insiders suggest, came when the couple's public visibility increased dramatically. Royal tours, interviews, and charity work placed them in the spotlight in unprecedented ways. Harry's choices, increasingly informed by Meghan's perspectives, began to diverge sharply from William's guidance. The brothers' private conversations reportedly became tense, with William urging caution, emphasizing loyalty, and warning of consequences, while Harry asserted autonomy, defended personal choice, and pursued a vision of life that prioritized personal happiness and emotional authenticity. At the same time, Meghan herself became a lightning rod in the media. Criticism of her, fair or otherwise, often reflected back on Harry, intensifying his protective instincts and his willingness to challenge tradition. William observed these dynamics with concern, recognizing patterns that suggested potential long-term conflict. Yet he also knew the importance of brotherly support, of allowing Harry to grow, to make mistakes, and to define his own path. The tension was palpable, the stakes enormous, and the emotional pressure unrelenting. And this is where it gets even more complicated. William's frustration, loyalty, and sense of responsibility eventually converged into words that would shock Harry and the world. He reportedly said, in a private moment of heartbreak and candor, "I don't recognize my brother anymore." He chose fame over family. Imagine hearing that from someone who knew every secret, every triumph, every